Welcome in, everybody. It is another oral history coming at you here today on the Take It Easy podcast and our Comical Sports YouTube channel. So today I wanted to talk about the Gonzaga Bulldogs and the story of them, not just going back like the last 5 years or so, but going back 10, 20 years to talking about Gonzaga. Because Mark Few had a quote a few years ago. He's the head coach who you'll learn about as the head honcho of the most unique dynasty in all of college basketball. Mark Few talked about how there's an entire generation of kids and now young adults, like into your 20s and 30s, who have never witnessed Gonzaga not make the tournament, has never witnessed Gonzaga not making Sweet 16s, Elite Eights, and Final Fours. Gonzaga has been a college basketball powerhouse for a quarter century. And the fact that they started from a program in the West Coast Conference, which at the time was like the 17th or 18th biggest conference, like they were a true one bid conference every single year. The fact that Gonzaga from that conference built a powerhouse on par with Duke and with Kentucky and with college basketball powerhouses consistently with success across the past 25 years is really, really incredible. And the story of how they got there is really impeccable and I think unique to the history of college basketball. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you also want to hear our other oral histories, we did one on the Detroit Lions back in September. October, we did one on the Chargers, the San Diego Chargers, of course, Florida State football, Clemson football, Texas Tech football. We've done a bunch of these in the past, and I wanted to bring Gonzaga in here. So by the time many of you are listening to this, Gonzaga may have been bounced in the Sweet 16 of March Madness this year, but there's also a chance that by the time many of you are listening to this, Gonzaga finds themselves in the Final Four for the third time in 5 March Madnesses. They are the number 1 seed in college basketball for the second consecutive season. And they, from the West Coast Conference, which now has become a little bit of a college basketball powerhouse, have gotten top one and done prospects in each of the past 2 recruiting classes. And we'll talk about that more coming up later. But to begin, let's go all the way back to the 1980s, because Gonzaga University is a small school in Spokane, Washington. They are not a state school. They're a private school. They're not the University of Washington in terms of funding. They're not Washington State. They are a really, really small school in Washington. They're in the capital of Washington even still, but they are still in a tiny, tiny city in Washington. And Washington State, like the state of Washington, not the school Washington State, Washington State, as much as we talk about them being a basketball powerhouse, like great players from Jamal Crawford on down have come from Washington, they don't really go to the schools there. Washington basketball has never really been a powerhouse. And Gonzaga's story starts in the early 1980s when Gonzaga got John Stockton to play for their school. Now, John Stockton was not a major prospect at the time, and John Stockton never made it to March Madness during his time under Dan Fitzgerald and Jay Hillcock back in the 1980s. He never played in March Madness. John Stockton was a mid-level first-round pick with all the talent in the world and went to the local school. But John Stockton never played in March Madness, and Gonzaga didn't build anything off of the back of John Stockton. Gonzaga didn't make the tournament for the next 5 years after John Stockton left, and another 6 years after John Stockton ended up becoming a powerhouse NBA superstar. Gonzaga under Dan Fitzgerald made the tournament for the first time in 1995, and they did it because they won their conference championship as the 4 seed in the West Coast Conference tournament. Gonzaga had a 500 record that year, and they were a 14 seed in March Madness in 1995. They had never made the tournament before that. Not one time, not with John Stockton, not in the years after John Stockton became an NBA superstar. It took until 1995 in a fluke season where they were 7-7 in conference play to make it to the tournament. And Gonzaga went to the NIT after that and all of that. And then Dan Monson took over the team in 1997. And Dan Monson had a bit of a magical season in 1999 with the Gonzaga Bulldogs, because Gonzaga that year ended up winning the West Coast Conference tournament. They had upsets against top 25 teams that year. It was a really interesting team that ended up having a crazy March Madness run as a 10 seed. They ended up making it to the Elite Eight that season. They beat Minnesota in the first round. Back then, Stanford was good, and they played their tournament games in Washington at the old Key Arena that's now the Climate Pledge Arena. And then they got to the Sweet 16 and became a Cinderella darling by beating Florida before they'd go on to lose in the Elite Eight. So Gonzaga was like one of these George Mason type of teams that went on this magical run out of this weird tiny conference on the West Coast, because the West Coast Conference in 1998 was such a small conference at this time. They didn't play football at all. It was Loyola Marymount University, which famously had the run with Bo Kimball, who Hank Gathers and Bo Kimball, who Hank Gathers died on the court playing basketball. And then they go on this magical Final Four run. Pepperdine, which used to be a big time program, the University of Portland. But there's not a whole lot of basketball teams here because these conferences barely even play football. And football is the massive revenue generating sport in all of at college sports. Football funds everything else in college sports. Basketball does about 20% of your revenue. But for major college programs, 80% of your revenue comes from football. And these schools weren't even playing football at the time. So men's basketball realistically was the largest revenue generating sport for the West Coast Conference, because even back in the 1990s, they were always guaranteed at least one team to make it to March Madness. And one team would give you a payout, as it does today. By putting one team in the tournament, you get a payout. And if that team wins, the conference gets money. It's a really weird system that's set up in college basketball. The more games your team wins, the more money your conference gets from the NCAA. The revenue of your success ends up getting split among all the member programs. And that's what happened for Gonzaga when they went to the Elite Eight in 1999. It was a Cinderella run that helped to fund the West Coast Conference's other basketball teams. And Dan Monson, after this Elite Eight run, ended up immediately jumping ship from Gonzaga to go to the University of Minnesota. Ironically, the team that Gonzaga beat in the first round of the tournament that year. And so in the spring of 1999, enter Mark Few. And Mark Few's the name that you probably know if you know anything about Gonzaga, because he is Coach K to that program. Mark Few inherited this program that the year before did go to the Elite Eight, and they had talented players held off from that team. You know, they go on a Sweet 16 run the following year with no-name guys, at least to the common eye, of Eric Childen and Richie Pham and Matt Santangelo. It's hard to pronounce his name, but they did not really have anybody that was of note. And they still made it back to the Sweet 16 the next season as a 10 seed in the tournament for the second time in a row. They were a 10 seed in the year 2000, or in 1999. In 2000, they were a 10 seed, and they made it back to the Sweet 16 the following year. They are a 12 seed in March Madness, and they get to the Sweet 16 again. Mark Few in his first two seasons with a 10 seed and a 12 seed goes to the Sweet 16 in back-to-back seasons. They were the equivalent of what Loyola Chicago is to what is now at the time the Missouri Valley Conference, but Loyola Chicago switched conferences semi-recently, or like what Butler was with Brad Stevens, where Butler ended up going to the Final Four in back-to-back years. 1 year as a 5 seed, 1 year as a 9 seed. And because of that, they ended up jumping over to the Big East. So this is a run of success that is program changing for Gonzaga, but Gonzaga doesn't change conferences. This is still the early 2000s. Conference realignment isn't really a thing yet in college sports. So you have to wait until 2011 for major conference realignment to go into effect. But anyways, then they go into the rebuilding process. They lose in the first round. They make it to the second round of the tournament in 2003. And then the first great era of Gonzaga basketball really starts to take effect, because now Mark Few's been at the job for 3 full seasons, which means that the players who are being recruited into the program are Mark Few's recruits. Now, Mark Few was the assistant behind Dan Monson before, so Mark Few obviously recruited a lot of those players. But with him as the head man by year 4, presumably all of the players in the program were recruited to Gonzaga by Mark Few. And so in 2003, you have a team with 3 future NBA players on the team: Ronnie Turioff, Adam Morrison, who we'll get to him in a second, and Jeremy Pargo, all of whom had like multiple year careers in the NBA. And Ronnie Turioff, I believe, won a championship with the Actually, Adam Morrison might have also won a championship with the Los Angeles Lakers of Kobe Bryant in 2010. And so Ronnie Turioff, Adam Morrison, and Pargo as a rookie in 2003 lose in the second round. Then in year 5 under Mark Few in 2004, they again make it to the second round of March Madness. And that year they went 14-0 in conference play. This was Adam Morrison's rookie year. He becomes a revelation across college basketball. They go undefeated in the West Coast Conference. They make it as a 3 seed to March Madness that year. As a 3 seed, the highest ranking Gonzaga has ever had in program history. They end up losing in the second round in an upset to Nevada. So they were a 2 seed and number 3 ranked in the entire country at this time. So Gonzaga found themselves in a position where they went undefeated in conference play, lost 3 games the entire season, were ranked top 5 in the country, and they lose in shocking upset fashion in the second round of the tournament. And in 2005, they brought back their entire team. Turioff was back. They brought back Adam Morrison. They brought back Pargo. It was supposed to be this great run of success the following season, and they again only lose 4 games the entire season, only lose 2 games in conference play, and run the table through the West Coast Conference like they've done every year since. They get a number 3 seed in March Madness, and in 2005, in the second round of the tournament, they lose on a last-second game winner by the Texas Tech Red Raiders, who were the 6th seed in their region that season. So 2004 and 2005, they lose 5 games the entire, they lose 7 games the entire 2 years. They lose 5 regular season games the entire 2 seasons. And Gonzaga only has 2 second round exits to show for it. But in 2006, Gonzaga ends up bringing back Adam Morrison for an additional season. They lose Ronnie Turioff, and now Pargo is coming into his own. They've also got other players who never end up going to the NBA, but they still have a period of success in European leagues and things of those sorts. And also, the way that Mark Few supplements the talent is by recruiting the state of Washington heavily at this time. He goes and gets Micah Downs from Kirkland, Washington as a freshman. Pargo doesn't come from here, but Pargo ends up being from Illinois. They get a starter from Clarkston, Washington. They go to Brewster, Washington. They go to Vancouver, Washington. They go to Spokane to get Adam Morrison in their backyard. They make sure to recruit the state of Washington for a bunch of their talent. And this goes all the way back to Few at the very beginning of his tenure. Is the best way that we're going to build talent is by keeping players at home. We are the best basketball program in the state of Washington, and we are going to recruit the state of Washington heavily. And so by this season, about 4 of their 8 main rotational players are from the state of Washington, and their bench is full of players from Spokane and Seattle and Brewster and Vancouver and all of these different places. And so in 2006, they end up again going undefeated in conference play. They lost 2 conference games in 3 seasons with Adam Morrison playing there. They finished the season ranked number 5 in the entire country, and they got as high as number 3 in the entire country in 2006. Tiny school in Spokane, Washington, playing in the West Coast Conference, gets to number 3 in the country. They end up being the number 3 seed in their tournament because they get seeded incredibly low, being punished for playing easy games on their schedule, even though they also beat the University of Stanford during this season, even though they beat Virginia, even though they beat Oklahoma State, even though they beat Washington State during this season. They beat Michigan State in a triple overtime classic in Maui as well. They get punished and get a 3 seed in the tournament, which means that they're set up in the Sweet 16, which is, again, their best run since Mark Few's first couple seasons where they were the Cinderella team. They get to the Sweet 16 and have to face the UCLA Bruins. And that UCLA team of 2006 was the beginning of a dynasty in college basketball. This is a team that had 8 NBA players on their team. They had Aaron Afalo, they had Cedric Bozeman, they had Darren Collison, Jordan Farmar, Ryan Hollins, Luke Richard, and Baamute. They would end up getting Russell Westbrook a couple years later. They'd get Kevin Love a couple years later. They'd end up going to 3 consecutive Final Fours beginning in 2006. And that season was the famous game where Adam Morrison is crying at the end of the game because Gonzaga lost on a last-second heave, and he knows it's his last game at Gonzaga. And now it's a famous video of the thrill of victory and agony of defeat, because Adam Morrison misses a last-second shot to beat UCLA, and he starts crying on the floor. And Adam Morrison to this day talks about how that's the thing that he's remembered for. He was All-American basketball player, top 5 pick in the NBA draft, and also pretty famous draft bust. Like, he's one of those players that the Charlotte Bobcats end up ruining his career, but he's still remembered for crying on the floor after losing to the University of or to UCLA in his last game at Gonzaga. And so this Gonzaga team, again, loses 2 conference games in 3 years. This Gonzaga team spent 3 consecutive seasons in the top 10 of college basketball, and they only had the Sweet 16 run and Adam Morrison to show for it, which in my defense, for the longest time, I thought that actually happened in the Final Four. I didn't realize that I thought it was also a game to go to the Final Four. It was a Sweet 16 game. And it's still remembered as one of the most famous college basketball games of all time because of how good that UCLA team would become and because Adam Morrison was crying on the court after losing. And it brought up all sorts of conversations about male vulnerability and how you're not supposed to cry in sports and all of that stuff. And all of it was very complex, but it's still remembered as one of the most famous games of that era of college basketball. So, in 2007, Jeremy Pargo is still there. They recruit Matt Bolden and Robert Sacre and Austin Day to come play for Gonzaga. But this is the beginning of a new era of Gonzaga basketball. They still make the tournament the next couple of years. They lose in the first round, and only because they win their conference championships and because of reputation does Gonzaga find themselves in this position. Gonzaga was a 7 seed when they lose in 2008. And in 2007, Gonzaga found themselves in the tournament as a 10 seed. And so Gonzaga makes the tournament these couple of years, winning their conference championship. And Gonzaga finds themselves in a really interesting place where now Mark Few is expanding his talent pool to recruit the world. Because in their same conference at this same time, they are also in a place where St. Mary's, who is another led by Randy Bennett, you probably saw them lose to UCLA this past weekend in March Madness. St. Mary's is the talent pool for Australia. Australia is working through this small little school in California because that's where they're recruiting people to. And so what's really interesting is that Mark Few gets to a place where he sees the success there, and as well as continuing to recruit the state of Washington heavily, Mark Few starts to recruit internationally. And Mark Few ends up recruiting all sorts of different players from different places, whether it be Kelly Olynyk from British Columbia or going to Alberta, Canada to get going to get Mengistu Arop to go play for their team. He ends up going to Canada a couple times there. He ends up going over to France to recruit players. And obviously these players also come to America for a season of high school basketball as he goes to recruit them. And so this is a really interesting change for Mark Few, because Mark Few, while they're still getting all of the people from Montreal, or he also went to Montreal, I should mention that as well. He goes to British Columbia to get Robert Sacre, and he goes to Montreal, Canada, and he recruits Canada and Europe for basketball players. And this is an interesting switch because he's still making the effort to recruit the best players in Washington, but is also going to places where there's a competitive advantage, because as the NBA in the 1990s begins to expand basketball to a global sport, there's now a generation of players in other countries who can come play American college basketball. And Randy Bennett at St. Mary's, also in the West Coast Conference, found a competitive advantage recruiting Australia, because Patty Mills comes and plays for St. Mary's. Matthew Dellavedova comes and plays for St. Mary's. There's a whole talent pool in Australia untapped in the recruiting systems. And since St. Mary's and Gonzaga can't compete in many of the American recruiting systems, they go to other countries to recruit players. And then eventually the schools see them as the leaders on that, and then they go and recruit other countries, whether it's Michigan bringing in the Wagner brothers and making a Final Four run with Moritz Wagner. Like, you start to see this change generations later, and the transfer portal changes the rules there. But to gain a competitive advantage, the West Coast Conference goes to other countries and starts to recruit. And so in 2009, now Gonzaga has built up a team with Bolden, with Sacre, with Austin Day. Pargo still has one more season as a senior, and they end up making another Sweet 16 run in the year 2009. And that year, Gonzaga found themselves in the tournament as a 4 seed. They were ranked number 10 in the country. As a number 4 seed, they end up going on a great Sweet 16 run by beating Akron and beating Western Kentucky and getting back to the place that they were when Adam Morrison fell on the court, and making Gonzaga relevant, even though they were in the tournament every year. Again, we should point out, this is now a decade where Gonzaga has gone making the tournament every single year. And this is also around the time where a coach changes programs, where you go from a smaller program like Gonzaga and you jump ship to a North Carolina or a Kansas or a Duke. But the thing is, none of these jobs are available. And so Mark Few continues to coach at Gonzaga and decides that he actively turns down power conference job offers to remain at Gonzaga. And he builds up another powerhouse program. In 2008, 2009, and 2010, Gonzaga ends up losing just 3 games in conference play during their entire run. They're also scheduling the Michigan States and the Michigans and the Virginias and the Dukes on their schedule in order to build up a resume for March Madness. And many times they're going in and beating these teams with the same caliber of recruits. And so now we move to 2010, and 2010 is an interesting season because now they bring in a new generation of Gonzaga basketball after that Sweet 16 run in 2009, which includes Stephen Gray, Kelly Olynyk, and son of John Stockton, David Stockton, playing for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. And in 2011, Gonzaga finds themselves making the tournament as an underdog team. They were unranked the entire season, and they end up making a deep run in the tournament by pulling off a miraculous upset against St. John's and then losing to BYU. But even still, Gonzaga found themselves turning their program back around once again. In 2012, they end up not winning the conference tournament for the only time in 20 years, the only time they didn't win a regular season or conference title. And this was Robert Sacre's final season, and Kelly Olynyk was now a junior, and he's becoming a top NBA prospect. And Gonzaga makes the tournament in a strong West Coast Conference that year. They make the tournament as a 7 seed, and they win a first-round game, and then they lose in the second round, like most 7 seeds end up doing. And then they get to 2013, where Kelly Olynyk is a senior and David Stockton is still playing there. And Gonzaga finds themselves on a collision course for another deep tournament run. They go 16-0 in conference play. They lose only 2 games the entire regular season. And they enter March Madness as the number 1 ranked team in the entire country, with Kelly Olynyk and Elias Harris and David Stockton. Gonzaga is the number 1 team in the entire country, and only by losing to Butler do they prevent themselves from possibly being a perfect team going into the tournament. They also lose early in the season to Illinois, but still, they lose 2 games the entire season, Butler and Illinois, and then they get to March Madness, and in the second round of the tournament, they lose to 9-seed Wichita State, led by Greg Marshall, another mid-major conference, beats them, and ends up going to the Final Four that season. 9-seed Wichita goes on a Final Four run that Gonzaga was supposed to have, if not for Kelly Olynyk losing in what is just randomness of March Madness. March Madness can be chaotic and random and dumb at times. Kelly Olynyk ends up going to the draft, and he's drafted as the 13th overall pick. Gonzaga's now sent 9 different players to the NBA, 6 of which get drafted for Gonzaga across Mark Few's tenure, and they still only have a couple of Sweet 16 appearances, or about 4 or 5, but only Sweet 16 appearances to show for it. And by 2015, that's when the transition changes here for Gonzaga, because they've gone to recruit internationally. They've gone to recruit the state of Washington. And now Mark Few begins to dip his toe in the water in building a one and done program, which is crazy to think about. It's the University of Gonzaga. This is in the West Coast Conference. They're not playing elite competition in conference play. Now they're scheduling elite competition out of conference play, but inside the conference, they're not a dominant team. And yet Mark Few gets to a place where he says, I have reached a point where I can go after Duke, and I can go after Kentucky, and I can go after Arizona, and I can be a one and done program. And the first recruit that he gets in the one and done cycle, Domantas Sabonis. Y'all know Domantas Sabonis. He plays for the Sacramento Kings now, NBA All-Star. He ends up spending 2 years at Gonzaga, but it was universally believed when he first left school, Sabonis was going to be, or when he first got to college, Sabonis was going to be a one and done player. And so this was the next way to get over the hump, was recruiting not just players who were going to be there for multiple years, but going to Lithuania and recruiting the son of Arvydas Sabonis, who is, most people would consider, he is a Hall of Famer. He made the Hall of Fame of basketball and would have been an NBA star if he hadn't been playing in the former Soviet Union for the very beginning of his career. But he made the Basketball Hall of Fame, and his son was a top 5-star recruit. And he went to Gonzaga, and Gonzaga had a team with Byron Wesley and Eric McClellan and this new guy named Kyle Wiltshire, who ends up becoming a great player for Gonzaga, but we'll get to him in a little bit. But Kyle Wiltshire is the star player on these teams, along with Kelly Olynyk. He's the one holdover from those teams that went on those deep tournament runs. And now there's a pool of freshmen with Domantas Sabonis at the head who are changing the game for the University of Gonzaga. And Gonzaga in 2015, again, loses 2 games the entire regular season. They made the second round in their first year together, but in their second year together, Gonzaga ends up going to the Elite 8 in 2015. They lost 2 games the entire regular season. They were ranked as high as number 2 in the country before losing to BYU late in the season in a weird fluky upset. They're the number 2 seed in their tournament, and they make it to the Final Four, matched up against Jahlil Okafor's Duke team. And Jahlil Okafor's Duke team was really, really good. I still say to this day, Jahlil Okafor is the most dominant college basketball player I have ever seen. and he didn't do anything in the NBA. That dude was amazing at basketball. And Duke and Gonzaga in a 1-2 matchup meet for the chance to go to the Final Four. And Jahlil Okafor dominates the Gonzaga Bulldogs. And Jahlil Okafor wins the national championship for Duke a week later after beating the University of Gonzaga. And so Sabonis ends up going to the NBA, and they end up having that one and done transition. But now there's an interesting switch, because now they go and recruit more one and done players, and they start working the transfer portal, because coming from Washington to Gonzaga is a guard named Nigel Williams-Goss, and coming from the University of Missouri is a forward named Jonathan Williams, both of whom would start on the 2017 Gonzaga team, which we'll get to in a second. But first, 2016. In 2016, they decide, with Kyle Wiltshire still there as a senior, and them coming off of the season where they just barely missed the Final Four. And this year, they're kind of in a rebuild, but they're not in a rebuild because they're just kind of retooling the roster a little bit. And Sabonis is left, and it's Williams-Goss, and it's Jonathan Williams, and it's this guy from Poland named Przemek Karnowski. And Karnowski ends up coming to Gonzaga in 2012, battling injuries his entire career, and through this entire run being deep in the bench, but also being 7'1", 300 pounds as a center for Gonzaga. And it's only when Sabonis ends up leaving, and only when they need to replenish the roster, that Przemek Karnowski from Poland ends up being a starter for the 2016 and 2017 Gonzaga Bulldogs teams. So now we get to 2017, and another one and done player enters the fold for Gonzaga, and that is Zach Collins. Y'all may remember Zach Collins. Zach Collins found himself as one of the top one and done prospects coming out of the college recruits. He was a 5-star recruit, according to 4.5 to 5-star recruit, depending on which system you're looking at. And Zach Collins and Killian Tilly, who's not a one and done, but ends up being a 4-star recruit, ends up coming to Gonzaga. They also get a 3-star from Japan, and Killian Tilly from France, by the way. They get a 3-star recruit from Japan named Rui Hachimura, who is someone that, if you know the NBA now, he currently plays for the Washington Wizards. But during this 2017 season, Rui Hachimura couldn't even find the floor on this Gonzaga team, because Gonzaga had so many players. They went like 9 deep into their roster, and all of them had a chance to play either G League basketball or in Europe or another country sometime down the road. They had Karnowski as the starter. They had Nigel Williams-Goss as a fifth year point guard playing for their team at this point. They had Jonathan Williams. Remember the transfer we mentioned a second ago? Both of them were starting. Jordan Matthews was a top recruit. Josh Perkins was a rookie on these teams or a freshman who had just come in. Killian Tilly was a freshman. Zach Collins was a one and done player who was going to be picked 10th in the NBA draft in 2017. He couldn't even start on this Gonzaga team because he was behind 7'1", 295-pound Przemek Karnowski. Top 10 pick in the draft. Couldn't find the floor on this Gonzaga team. It was a perfect confluence of events that also led to Zach Norville, who will become an intricate part of the team a couple years later. He ends up redshirting that year. So they don't even have a player who would become a star years down the road. And Rui Hachimura is like the 12th guy deep on the bench. Future top 10 pick in the NBA draft is the 10th guy deep on this Gonzaga bench. And this Gonzaga team was so good. And I know we've talked about a couple of really good Gonzaga teams. 2013 with Kyle Olynyk and Kyle Wiltshire. Yeah, that team was incredible. 2006, when they were the number 1 team in the entire country. That team was also really, really good. This Gonzaga team lost one game the entire season. One pitiful game the entire season. They beat top teams all over too. They beat Arizona, who was ranked in the top 10. They beat Iowa State, who was ranked in the top 25. They beat Florida, who was ranked in the top 25. They beat St. Mary's twice when they were ranked in the top 25. They were undefeated the entire season until they lost to BYU the last game of the season. They still got to be the number 1 seed. They just lost the chance to be undefeated going into conference play in the last game of the season to goddamn BYU. But they get the number 1 seed. They get to March Madness. They dominate the first 3 rounds of the tournament. They win by 20. They win by 10. They barely edge out a win against West Virginia in the game that they usually tended to lose in the past. And they make it to the Elite 8. And fortunately for them, they get an amazing break. Finally, they get an amazing break. And they get to play Chris Mack, who looks like Vladimir Putin's underdog 11 seed Xavier. I forgot what their name is, but Xavier from the Big East. I think they're the Wildcats, maybe. Xavier is a Cinderella team, and Gonzaga dominates them 36-1. Only one loss the last game of the season. Top 10 NBA players can't even start on these teams. And for the first time, Mark Few makes it to the Final Four at the University of Gonzaga. And they get to the Final Four and they get another great break because they get another Cinderella team. They get to play South Carolina of Frank Martin. And I believe that team had, the guy who was he's on the Clippers. I'm so mad that I can't remember his name now, but they had 2 NBA players on their team, but they were a 7 seed and they put up a fight, but Gonzaga won, and Gonzaga got to play for the national championship. And by the way, they were favored in the national championship game. They were playing North Carolina, who was a 1 seed, and the year before had lost in the national championship to Villanova. The Gonzaga Bulldogs were favored against a 1 seed who just went to the championship the year before. And Gonzaga, down 4 at the very end, gets us the ball stolen, an outlet pass to Justin Jackson, and dunked to lose the game. They were down 5 then. They'd lose the game by 6, but they had 1 possession to try and tie the game at the end of the national championship, and they couldn't quite get it done. And Gonzaga got to be so close to forever being a champion, to putting up a banner at a tiny school in the middle of Spokane, Washington, that was now growing into a gigantic school because Gonzaga saw its admissions rise in the aftermath of this era. They had gone now 1 and done with Zach Collins, who would go to the draft that year. They had recruited internationally, whether it was Karnowski or whether it was Kelly Olynyk or Robert Sacre or not Kyle Wiltshire, but they went internationally to recruit stars. They recruited the state of Washington, whether it be Adam Morrison or whether it be Kyle Wiltshire. They recruited stars out of the state of Washington, and they would get another star from Washington in this next coming draft recruiting class named Corey Kispert. Keep that name in the back of your mind for when we get to the most recent run of Gonzaga basketball. So they'd get Corey Kispert to come play. They'd also still go to France and get a 4-star recruit named Joel Ayayi. Keep that name in mind when we get to the next era of Gonzaga basketball. They had done all of that and were doing 1 and done recruiting now, and were working the transfer portal, because who did they get as a transfer following the championship run? A future draft pick named Brandon Clark, who would end up forgoing his eligibility after 1 season at Gonzaga in 2018 to get drafted by the Memphis Grizzlies. Brandon Clark, also preseason Hall of Famer on the Take It Easy podcast's preseason Hall of Fame. But anyways, in 2018, they make it to the Sweet 16, again, only losing 1 conference game the entire season. They lost a bunch of people from their other teams, but they were still a really talented team. They were a 4 seed, and they made it to the Sweet 16. They actually got an easy matchup against Florida State that year, and they end up losing to Florida State. But still, they had a matchup against Florida State. And this is a team now, again, from where we started 20 years ago. Gonzaga was a tiny program in the West Coast Conference. In 2014, I skipped over this, they had a flirtation with joining the Mountain West, but only as a basketball school. And Gonzaga as a program decided to stay in the West Coast Conference, in part because the Mountain West wasn't super enthusiastic about adding an only basketball program. But Gonzaga was the best team there no questions asked. Gonzaga, by this point, with UCLA having an incredibly long down period following that run of success in the 2000s, USC being flexible, San Diego State being great, as I will attest. They had Kawhi Leonard. They made the tournament 6 straight years. Their success couldn't rival what Gonzaga was doing. West of, say, Memphis or North Carolina, or let's say west of Kansas, there was no program better than the Gonzaga Bulldogs from the West Coast Conference that never made the tournament until 1995 and never made it past the Sweet 16, even though they were consistently a top 5 team 15 years ago. And they kept sustaining success year after year after year. And in 2019, they went undefeated again, lost 3 games the entire season. And Gonzaga had a team now with Brandon Clark, Rui Hachimura starting, Kispert working his way into the lineup, Zach Norville, I mentioned him earlier. Good thing you remembered him. And still a holdover from the freshman national championship run, Josh Perkins. They also had Filip Petrusev from Serbia. He was a big on that team. Killian Tilly was still playing there from France. They had gone international. They had gone to the national recruiting pool. They had gone to the state of Washington. They had gone through the transfer portal. They'd gone into California. They were a national recruiting powerhouse in so many different places with so many different people in different worlds that end up recruiting everyone to the same place in a really, really fascinating trend. And that year, in 2019, they end up being number 1 in the entire country. They finished the season ranked number 1 in all of college basketball in 2019. They get to be a number 1 seed for the 4th time, and they make it to the Elite 8, where they lose to a 3rd seed Texas Tech Red Raiders team, who goes to the national championship game and loses in overtime to the University of Virginia. So 2 years removed from making the national championship, Gonzaga has a season where they are a number 4 seed in March Madness, and then they're a number 1 seed the very next season. It took 2 years to replenish all of their talent. In 2020, they lost 2 games the entire season. They were going to be a number 1 seed in March Madness, and then the COVID-19 pandemic canceled the season for Gonzaga. One of their best teams in 2020. They were going to be a number 1 seed for the 2nd consecutive year. Then we get to 2021. And if you remember last season, that was the magical Gonzaga basketball team that went undefeated in the regular season. Number 1 team in the entire country. And they had a big 4 because that year they recruited in 2020. They recruited Jalen Suggs, the number 1 recruit in the entire country. And they recruited a man named Julian Strother, who came from Nevada. He was also a 4-star recruit. And Dominic Harris from California, 4-star recruit. Gonzaga brought in a one-and-done stud in Jalen Suggs and brought in more 4-star recruits to their class. And Gonzaga in 2021, with the number 1 recruit in the country, Jalen Suggs, along with a recruit from Texas who they got in 2019 named Drew Timme. If you know him right now, Drew Timme is now a senior at Gonzaga, who is the best player on this current Gonzaga team, along with Kispert from Washington and Joel Ayayi. That big 4 went undefeated. All 4 of them would get drafted, but that big 4 went undefeated in conference play, undefeated in the regular season, number 1 overall seed in March Madness, and they kicked ass. And the reason I'm fascinated by this team so much, and this team last year was actually the reason that I wanted to do this story with the University of Gonzaga, is because the perfect culmination of all of this run for Gonzaga, it was a one-and-done recruit, the best recruit to ever come to Gonzaga. He's a top 5 pick in the NBA draft. They had reached a place where one-and-done recruits wanted to come to Gonzaga. They got one-and-done recruit. They got star from the state of Washington, Corey Kispert, who would end up being a top lottery pick in the NBA draft in 2021. They got Drew Timme, top 4-star national recruit from Texas. And they got Joel Ayayi, international player. And all of it was a perfect culmination of everything Gonzaga had been doing. Andrew Nembhard, who also played on that team, transfer player. All of the different routes came together, and Gonzaga built a powerhouse team with all the different ways. They started out recruiting Washington. Then they went international. Then they went to the transfer portal. Then they tried to get one and dones with Sabonis and Collins, and now Jalen Suggs, and soon to be Chet Holmgren, who was going to be a top 5 pick in this year's NBA draft, who Chet is presumably the best player on Gonzaga, although most people would say it's Drew Timme. And they were the number 1 overall seed this year in March Madness. So Gonzaga, for the 4th consecutive season, was a number 1 seed. For the 6th time in 10 years, 6th time in 9 years, was a number 1 seed. Gonzaga is the powerhouse program of college basketball who somehow never goes through cycles. And that undefeated Gonzaga team, you may remember last year with the Jalen Suggs buzzer beater against UCLA, lost in the national championship game, about to become the first perfect team in the history, going back 70 plus years in college basketball. The 1970s was the last time there was a perfect team. The 1976 Hoosiers, the last perfect team in college basketball. And Gonzaga was 1 game away, 31-0. They lost the last one to Baylor. And this year's team just might be eliminated by the time you're listening to this, but they also just might be in the Final Four for the 3rd time in 5 years, with a 4th consecutive team with a number 1 seed. I know they didn't seed the tournament in 2020, but they would have been a number 1 seed. 4 straight years as a number 1 seed, 6 times in 9 years, 20 years consecutively making the tournament. And Mark Few, who is, not necessarily the most well-liked guy in college basketball circles, somehow builds from Gonzaga University, the powerhouse program of the 2010s in college basketball. And they are part of the changing landscape of college basketball, which is you don't have to go to a Duke. You don't have to go to a Kentucky. You don't have to go to a Kansas to be a star player. One and done players are rejecting those programs altogether and want to just go straight from high school once the NBA rules begin to change. And it's so fascinating to see this change of the college sports landscape over the past, shall we say, 15, 20 years, led by a tiny school in Spokane, Washington, and a guy named Mark Few, who for 20 years stayed at Gonzaga, oversaw the Gonzaga program, and somehow built up a powerhouse program with 10 runs to the Sweet 16, making the tournament every year for 20 years, 6 number 1 seeds, actually 7 number 1 seeds, now that I think about it. Well, no, I guess the Adam Morrison team wasn't. 6 number 1 seeds in 9 years. Gonzaga has built a legitimate powerhouse program, not beyond Kansas, beyond Duke, beyond North Carolina. Mark Few and his tiny little program with a 6,000 seat arena in Spokane, Washington, has outlived all of the great coaches in college basketball and played the system so well that he built a powerhouse basketball program, bringing the top NBA draft prospects, top transfer players, and 4- and 5-star recruits to Gonzaga in Spokane, Washington, while doing it all in the West Coast Conference, which is a much better conference today simply because they have Gonzaga, but also put as many teams in the tournament this year as the Pac-12 and as many teams making it past the first round as the SEC and Mountain West conferences combined. And it's a really incredible, incredible story about what happened to the West Coast Conference and Gonzaga simply because this program exists. And it's incredible, incredible that a tiny school in Spokane, Washington changes the entire college basketball landscape and goes from a no-name program making Cinderella runs as a 10 seed to 20 years later without a giant alumni base dominating college basketball. That's why I spent an hour talking about this Gonzaga team.